All right, welcome to your first lecture here in U.S. history with Ms. Shaw. We're really going to be talking today about the road to independence. So, kind of looking at the colonies before America became America, and really thinking about the complications and the messiness that led to independence. So, the first thing that we need to talk about are the colonial differences. So, Great Britain really began to establish colonies in the 1600s. But it's important that you understand that there were different types of colonies that were being established for different reasons in different regions and different areas. So because that there were different types of colonies, they had different forms of government. Some of them had more involvement from England than others. Some, like the charter colonies, could really kind of do their own thing. They had a charter from the king to set up a colony and do what they wanted. Others, like royal colonies, were much more micromanaged by the British government or by the crown. These different regions had different economies, therefore, they had different needs and different priorities. So, as the colonists began to talk about independence, those needs really came into play, and those different priorities and those just key differences based on their economies really came into play. The first set of colonies I want to mention were the New England colonies. So these were farther to the north. The focus of the economy in New England was primarily industry. So they were really focused on making things. There were certainly farms, but these were much more kind of subsistence farms or farms for families or small groups of people. And so, again, most of the money was made through making things. The middle colonies, here identified in purple, what we see primarily for the economy here was trade or commerce. So, using those ports, using the ocean as a way to transport goods from different areas throughout the colonies. New York, as we all know, Manhattan, right? New York, becoming one of the most famous ports of the time. And then finally, the southern colonies. And this is where we see that large scale agriculture that was taking place. So, in the southern colonies, we see them growing products that were primarily sold to Great Britain and New England in the middle colonies. Now, the products during this time, the crops that were primarily grown during colonial times, was primarily tobacco, rice, and indigo. Today, a lot of us think of cotton as the primary crop of the South, but that's really not true until about the 1830s. So, for a long time, especially as the colony, before we became an independent nation, as the colonies were establishing themselves, tobacco, rice, and indigo were the primary crops that were grown in the South. Now, one of the things that's important for you to understand is not only are the differences key, that each of these colonists in these different regions had different needs and wants. The other thing that's really important is that colonists came from England with the idea of self government. This was something that was already instilled in British citizens before they even came to the United States or to what was North America at the time to establish colonies. They came with the idea that of self-government, and this was common to all people. And what this really means is that the people control the government, right? That's what self-government is. The first concept of self-government, it's important that you understand, this is one example that the colonists came with, was the idea of limited government. This means that government cannot be all powerful, that people in power can't do whatever they want. The people in power also have to follow the rules or the laws of society. That those in power are not unlimited in terms of their power, but that rather the government itself is limited in its scope. It's limited in what it's able to do. And this is a really key component of self-government that colonists came to the New World with. Another component that British citizens came to the colonies with was representative government. This means that government must represent the needs of the people. This is most commonly done through voting. right? And so we elect representatives who make decisions on behalf of the people who vote for them. So this is another key component of self-government that the colonists came here with. So not only did these colonial adventurers and did these colonists come to this new world, or what they deemed as a new world, not only did they come here with this idea of self-government, but up until this mid 1700s, late 1700s, the colonists really had a history of self-government. Colonists had a long history of governing themselves. Great Britain really left them alone. As long as Great Britain was making money, why change anything? If you remember, hopefully you learned back in eighth grade about the triangle trade. That's this picture down here in the bottom right hand corner. This was the trade routes, right? And so you see different items and people, frankly, being traded or sold and kidnapped and taken from one place to another. And Great Britain was making a lot of money with this. And so, again, if it's not broke, why fix it? And so the colonies really had this history of self government. They were mostly left alone while they were colonies. Another example of this history of self-government is many colonies had colonial constitutions, and so this goes back to the idea of limited government. Many of these colonies, Carolina, for an example, laid out what their government looked like, what laws applied to all the people, thus limiting the power of those who were elected to official positions. They couldn't do whatever they wanted because these constitutions limited their power. Another thing that we saw were these legislative branches that existed in many other colonies as well. Colonies had elections for colonial legislative branches. They had representative governments throughout many of them. One of the most famous ones was in Virginia with the House of Burgesses, again, where the colonists of Virginia elected representatives from their area to go and make laws on behalf of that area. We call them the constituents, the people who vote for them. And so these are just some examples of this history of self government that the colonies had had for a long time. We begin to see some protest when the self government that many of these colonists had experienced for a long time began to be threatened. One of the first ways that self government was threatened in the colonies was through the French Indian War. Now, the French Indian War was actually a war between France and Great Britain. However, it was France and Native Americans who were allies or friends, and it was them fighting against Great Britain. Now, one of the important things here is this is the first war that we see take place between kind of what we call old world powers or Great Britain and France, but it takes place in what's considered to be the New World land, right, in North America. So the French Indian War is technically a war between France and Great Britain. So it's French and Native Americans or indigenous people allied together against Great Britain. Now, ultimately, Great Britain wins this war with the help of the colonists. They fight because they are British citizens, so they fight on behalf of Great Britain. And it's during this time where the British colonists are like, "Hey, we don't need your protection anymore. Look what we did. We just won this war. We can take care of ourselves." Right? They no longer need the protection of the British. Because they won the war, the colonists have decided that this proves that they can take care of themselves. However, after the war ends, Great Britain is like, hey, we can't protect you. We can't keep up. It's too expensive to pay all of our soldiers to protect you against Native Americans as colonists continue to move further and further east. So, one of the things that's important you understand is along here, you can kind of see where my cursor is, right? Along the coast of the colonies, this is where most of the colonists lived. However, as more and more people show up, as more and more families begin to grow, people move further east. And as they move east, they encounter the indigenous people of the land. So after the French Indian War, the British come up with the Proclamation of 1763, and they draw this line. And they tell the British colonists they can no longer move west of that line. They can't go into what was the Ohio River Valley that many of the colonists believed that they fought for and that they deserved to live there. And so for many colonists, this was that self-government being threatened. They felt like the British government was overstepping their boundaries. They had won this war. They didn't need the protection anymore. However, as you can imagine, if they did move over here into, so you can see this map is labeled as Indian Reserve, as they moved over across this line and they were attacked by indigenous peoples who had lived on this land for generations and generations, those colonists immediately went crying right back to Great Britain, saying, "Yeah, I was attacked, help me." And the British government was like, they were frustrated. They were saying, "We told you not to go over there." But you can understand why the colonists believed that at this point, by the British drawing this line, saying, "You cannot move into this land. I know you believe you fought for it, but you're not allowed to move over there." The colonists believed that their right to self government was threatened. Another way that hopefully you remember from other history classes in middle school, another way that the colonists felt their right to self government was threatened was through taxation without representation. So the colonists believed if they weren't being represented in government, they then they don't have a voice. And if they don't have a voice, they shouldn't be taxed, right? However, Britain said, hey, only people who live in England can serve, and you're a British citizen, so you're really kind of being represented just because just because nobody from where you live is serving in Parliament doesn't mean that your needs aren't represented. And so the people in the colonies truly felt that this was not a representative government, right? They said that if we aren't going to be represented, we shouldn't have to pay you money. You're not allowing us as citizens of England to send a representative for us. Therefore, we shouldn't have to give you taxes, right? No taxation without representation. So, this is another form of protest that we begin to see throughout the colonies, and people begin to make this cry: no taxation without representation. Another thing happens in 1765 with the Stamp Act. So, the Stamp Act was a tax on all paper goods. The colonies responded by protesting this Stamp Act. They didn't think that it was appropriate, they thought it was silly. And so Great Britain decided that they would go ahead and repeal this act or this tax. So they took it away. They decided, you know what, the protest isn't worth it. This Stamp Act isn't worth it. So they decided to go ahead and repeal it. So we see this protest starting to play out. The next one that's important that I want to highlight is the tea tax of 1773. So we see about 8 years later, the Tea Act is a tax on tea, which was a really important drink of the time. The colonists responded by participating in what was called the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Hopefully you remember this, but this is where the Sons of Liberty dressed up as indigenous people. They boarded a ship and they threw the British tea into the Boston harbor. Now, this was not the first rebellion in Boston. Boston and Massachusetts in general is known for much of their rebellion. In 1770, they had had the Boston Massacre, where some of the local citizens of Boston began throwing snowballs filled with rocks at the British soldiers, and the British soldiers fired back, and it became a whole big protest and outcry against the violent acts of the British soldiers. So the Boston Tea Party was not the first time that we see um, rebellion from Boston. Ultimately, Great Britain responds to the Boston Tea Party with punishment. Great Britain decides to punish the colonies through what are called the intolerable acts or the coercive acts. The most important thing that you need to understand about this punishment is they took away the right to self government for the colony of Massachusetts. And so not only is this now just a threat to their self government, but Great Britain straight up took away the right of self government to Massachusetts, to the colony. Not only that, but they closed Boston Harbor, as you see here in the picture. which means if the harbor isn't open, they can't do business. If ships can't come in, remember, industry is happening in New England. And so taking the goods that are made in New England and selling them to other colonies, that can't happen if the harbor is closed. So not only are they taking away Massachusetts as a colony, their right to self government, but the major port, Boston, is now closed. And so they've taken away the right for Boston to run their economy and to govern itself. It's through all of this that we finally start to see some steps to independence. So we see some protests that had happened. Now we start to see some steps to independence. The first thing we see happen is the First Continental Congress. This is in 1774. And this is formed in direct response to those intolerable acts that I talked about in Boston. The goal of this Congress, the goal of this meeting, was to repair the relationship with Great Britain. And so the outcome was the Declaration of Colonial Rights, saying, "Hey, yo, King of England, here's our rights, and you really need to help us. Like, you need to grant us these rights, not just grant us, but these are our rights. So, you know, let us have those rights." It's kind of what it said. They also decided that they were going to boycott British goods, so not buy anything that was made in Great Britain. It's at this point that we see Great Britain decide and declare that the colonies are now in a state of rebellion. At this point, the British soldiers come marching in, and it's here where we have the Battle of Lexington and Concord in 1775. Now, it's important that you understand the First Continental Congress. Now, in the picture here, I have this olive branch because that was really the key. The goal was to repair the relationship. Now, again, in order to communicate, you had to send a ship back and forth with a letter. There were no telephones. There was no way for instant communication. So while this meeting is happening, while Great Britain is getting the letters and sending responses back, which could take months, the British soldiers are already here. And Lexington and Concord is a battle that takes place in Massachusetts. And to this day, we don't know who fired the first shot. All we do know is we have colonists on one side of a field, British soldiers on the other side of the field. Somebody fires and shots break out. And this is really seen as the beginning of the American Revolution, or the War for Independence. After Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress meets. And the goal of this Congress is really to organize, to handle the affairs during the war. War has broken out. We are now at war with Great Britain for independence, and we must handle what's going on. And it's here, through the Second Continental Congress, that we finally see this actual act of independence happening. This wasn't something that took place very quickly. Colonists were divided pretty equally into thirds. One third wanted independence, one third didn't want independence. They were loyalists, loyal to the Crown of England, and one third were just like, dude, let me live my life, whatever. Right? They just wanted to they didn't really care one way or the other. So there was a lot of arguing, there was a lot of discussion, but it's ultimately out of the Second Continental Congress that we do finally get to independence, and we ultimately send the Declaration of Independence to England. We'll be looking at the Declaration of Independence more closely in class. This is the end of the lecture. Please make sure to reach out. If you have any questions, you can email me. You can message me on Reminder, visit my office hours. You can also make sure that you also meet with somebody in class, review the lecture notes, revise, question, and summarize your notes. Have a great day.